Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the webinar series brought to you by the National Compadres Network and sponsored by DHCS. Our webinar today entitled Cargas y Regalos, the Challenges and Culturally Based Strengths of Raza, will be moderated by Mr. Jerry Tello. Today's presenters are Dr. Yvette Flores Ortiz. Dr. Flores Ortiz is an Associate Professor of Chicano and Chicana Studies at UC Davis. She is an expert on Latino mental health issues, including adolescence, aging, violence, self-esteem, AIDS prevention, substance abuse, and sexuality. Our next presenter is Dr. Ricardo Carillo. Dr. Carillo is a private practice clinical forensic psychologist. He is currently the director of a prevention and early intervention project for La Clínica de la Raza, and he does research for the California Endowment on Disparities in Latino Mental Health. Our final distinguished presenter on this panel today is Mr. Cuco Rodriquez. Mr. Rodriguez has over 18 years of social service experience. He is the Division Chief of Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Services for the County of Santa Barbara. His responsibilities include overseeing and implementing MHSA services as well as providing leadership and oversight of cultural competence requirements for alcohol, drug, and mental health services. Welcome, presenters. Now, just as we go into a few housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded and can be found on the CIMH YouTube channel. Everyone at this moment is on mute by default. And if you have any questions, please write in your questions box and we'll capture your questions and the moderator will try to answer them as we go along with the presentations, or we will also address them during our question and answer session. If you have a comment and you would like to verbalize your comment, please raise your hand by clicking on the icon that looks like a hand, and we will unmute your line. Okay, as of right now, I am going to now turn it over to Jerry, and we will go ahead and begin with the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Buenos dias, good morning to everybody, and I want to thank especially the panelists that have agreed to share their knowledge and wisdom and experience with us today, but to all of you as well that have blessed us with your presence today. We thank you as we go on this journey to attempt to find that interconnection between gifts or harmony, blessings in our lives, and those things which become challenges, which we would call cargas or baggage. If you were on the webinar last week, we began by talking about the significance of tradition and culture. And we acknowledge that in all cultures all over the world there was a way of honoring that became a significant part of everyday life. Whether you honored your greater source, whether you honored your relations, whether you honored yourself, you honored the day, the rising of the sun, or the transition to the moon and the earth, the wind, all of those things. And so we want to begin in the way that we've been taught by our ancestors, is to ask for permission and give thanks to all the universe, to all the relations, to all our elders, and we thank them for all this wisdom and traditions and the things that they left us along the way, the sacrifice that they have made in order to allow us to be here. And we thank the women, the first givers of life, and those that teach us about nurturance and about love, and really are the first leaders in guiding us. We thank the men that are the duality, el otro yo and la quech, and we thank them for their courage and their leadership as well, and nurturance, and finally for that fourth direction of the children, in which we do all of this for. And it's said that whatever we do today will affect 7 generations. And so we attempt to do this in a good way, a very humble way. Begin by asking permission in that way, but also saying that we come in a respectful way. And so what we share today is not to judge in any way or say that our knowledge, the knowledge we share, is any better than anyone else's. And because we're focusing on one part of the universe, that which I guess now today we can term Chicano Latino, and we talked about that last week, about the whole thing of names. Names are not part of our culture. It doesn't define us. So we want to begin by acknowledging the collective dignity, love, trust, and respect of all people. And we believe that when all of that comes together, then we have the ability to bring harmony and beauty in our world. So these ancestral teachings that come from all peoples, but last week we went over these, the 4 ancestral teachings that are the basis of everything we do. You're wanted, you're a blessing, everyone has a sacred purpose, that there are teachings or values and teachers that are present, and that you are protected, safety, and secure, which means if you do not feel safe, then it's hard for you to learn, it's hard for you to heal, it's hard for you to be. And so our ancestors understood this, and so everything that was done was with this in mind. But we recognize the generational trauma too, and last week we talked about that generational trauma that we as a people carry, and it's part of who we are. And historically, even though it doesn't get talked about very much, and really in the history books, that we recognize that the estimates, it says here 20 million, but actually the estimates between 20 and 50 million ancestors of our people were killed, raped, abused, enslaved, and some of those things went on as recently as the 50s, and which in Santa Cruz there were lynchings and things like that. But today we recognize that some of that is still going on in terms of immigration and all the struggles that our people go through today. So, and the digressionary scale of what ends up happening to us, the confusion in our spirit, our identity, anger, the hate, the self-hate, and rage. And this is what we covered last week a little more extensively. So we're going to begin today, very, very blessed to have Dr. Flores with us today, and we're going to talk about that duality, the significance of male and female. And Dr. Flores is going to share her experience and insights in terms of working with the women and girls and the challenges, the struggles, the cargas, if you will, but also the blessings that come from that side. And we'd like to welcome you, Yvette. Thank you very much for all that you do and your work and your example. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the palabra to you.
Gracias, Jerry. Thank you, everyone. I am truly honored and blessed to be here in your presence. And as we move on, I'd like to translate the title of this presentation for you. I titled it The Latina, Perseverance, Passion, Power, and Peace as we respond to the burdens and the gifts. And as I do that, I would like to offer this presentation and invoke the blessing from my ancestors. Some of the women you see in the photograph that was previously on the screen. On your left is a photograph of my mother sitting in front of a lion. She is carrying me. She is with child at that point. And I invoke her because to me she epitomized resilience and passion and power and peace. And when she left this plane at 101 years of age, she left a very profound legacy. The greatest part of it being making me a teacher, because she was a teacher in the broadest sense of the word. So what I would like to share with you in this presentation this morning is part of the teachings that she imparted, but also a lot of the teachings that I've learned along the way from my comadres, my friends, and from the two little girls.
Okay, you need to move to the front. Mute everybody else except her.
You see two little girls and my dog. In this particular presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about how we can bring regain and attain balance, how we can create a path for ourselves and get there when there hasn't been a path to balance and to healing and to wholeness in our lives because of the intergenerational trauma that our families carry with us. I'd also like us to think about our own particular burdens as women and to begin to name some of the obstacles and identify the barriers to attaining the balance that leads to mental health. As we move on, in her powerful essay in Telling to Live, Norma Cantu talks about how as Latinas, we often are trailblazers. We have to create paths that haven't been there for us. Because Latinas, despite the fact that in the 21st century, we are primarily U.S. born, we continue to have a large influx of immigrants. And as a result of this continual influx of Latinas from the 21 countries that make up Latin America, and the fusion with the Raza that has been there since before the United States existed as a nation, we have created particular cultural formations that have been influenced by indigenous cultures. There is no label that captures us, and each of us is unique. But collectively, we continue to face multiple sources of discrimination: racial, ethnic, class, gender discrimination, discrimination on the basis of our sexuality and sexual orientation. And on a daily basis, we're faced with structural or systemic macro and microaggressions. We still face under-education, or what some scholars label subtractive education. That is, when we enter the educational system as children, full of excitement and wanting to learn, very often we are pigeonholed and labeled and stereotyped without our true essence of peoplehood that we bring being recognized. And that often in the process of education, we are forced to tear away at the layers of who we are, our religion, our spirituality, our culture, our language, our name. And this creates particular legacies for subsequent years, particularly with regards to education, but also in terms of identity and mental health. We know that while more Latinas enter college, fewer graduate. We're still a fraction of 1% of women with higher degrees. But those of us who have passed through the eye of the needle and have attained education, many of us have concentrated and made our lives work, empowering and bringing forward the future generations. Because part of the legacy of the Chicana and Chicano movement is to continue the struggle for violence, to set a modeling experience for younger generations so that we can carry forward and continue to reconnect with the past to make us strong and make us stronger and make us more healthy. Let's move on, please. As we think about the challenges in general that women face, we need to look at what are the challenges to mental health.
Yes, we're trying to move the slide on.
Okay.
Yeah.
There are a number of disparities, as some of you, I'm sure, who work in the field are aware, that while Latinas face a number of adverse circumstances and could access and could benefit from mental health services, Latinas continue to access mental health services at rates that are lower than would be expected. At the same time, studies that have been done find that Latinas have twice the rate of depression as Latino men. They also have very high prevalence of anxiety disorders. They face many situations of intimate partner violence, of sexual violence, of rape and incest, a lot of which happens in the family, a lot of which happens from people they love and trust. All of these experiences result in physical, emotional, and spiritual wounding. For every child and every woman who is abused, for every one of us who has suffered violence, we are embodying not only our own scars, but the scars of the genocide that happened to our ancestors. So the wounding is exacerbated, the trauma is exacerbated by the multi-generational trauma that we carry. Those of us who work with women know that most of women's mental health problems have at their root relationship problems that have to do with the fact that women are expected to be relational beings. Women are expected to focus their love, their attention on others and not to prioritize themselves. This creates an imbalance between the burdens and the gifts. So as mental health providers, we need to understand the cultural position of women within families and within societies so we can understand how the problems that they present are nuanced, not only by being female, but by being female within particular patriarchal context and within larger context of oppression. To simply address the woman's sorrow and her suffering emotionally does not address the suffering of her people, the suffering of her family, because we are collectivists. As women, we often find it difficult to focus our healing on ourselves alone if we are not also focusing on the healing of our families. It is very critical, in my experience, to look at women's mental health from a life cycle perspective, to understand the different needs and demands and expectations that women face throughout their lives. As children, women may be welcomed into a family and their arrival may be celebrated. Other girls are not so fortunate. Other girls have responsibilities sometimes greater than those that their years should command because they may be part of large families, because they have to help their mothers and fathers, because these individuals are working 2 and 3 jobs. So while a collectivist perspective says that we all chip in and we all support each other, growing up in the U.S. context, where individualism is considered an ideal and a norm, a young child may experience conflict between what she's expected to do and what culturally she knows she should do, and what she perceives her peers and others in more distant communities doing. This may be a source of stress. The expectations that sometimes we place on our girls as mothers is greater at times than that we place on our sons. It's also different. In my family, for example, it was believed that women were fundamentally innately strong. So there was an expectation that they would be strong and that they did not need much help. There was a focus on stoicism and a focus on being fuertes, being strong, being the core, the heart of a family. And while this may make sense within a similar cultural context, it may be a source of confusion when one is in a multicultural context. In adolescence, the expectation for girls changes, and there is a fear and a protection of women as they come of age, because most families recall at a cellular level the fundamental sexual abuse that women have experienced historically and begin to overprotect their daughters and begin to fear for their daughter's safety, which can contribute to anxiety in girls. As we know, the task of adolescence is blending of identities, forming a stronger rooted identity. And for women of color and Latinas in this case, this means integrating racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual identities to find a way to get on the right path, el buen camino, which is something that families expect. But sometimes immigrant parents do not know what the right path looks like in the United States, or can directly help their daughters or sons get to that path or navigate that path. It is very critical to understand that as women of the 20th and 21st century, Chicanas and Latinas also face a number of expectations that are the result of the civil rights movements, of the women's movements in the Chicano and Chicana movement. So women are expected not only to be the heart of the family, but they're also expected to be, in some families, guerrilleras, the warriors that are going to carry on the political struggle, and at the same time reproduce and have children and support spouses. And there is an expected heteronormativity in Latino cultures that can be very problematic for bisexual, lesbian, transgendered women who do not fit the particular molds that have been expected of them, that have been thrust upon them, as it were. So I'd like to call attention to a recent publication. It's a 2-volume series entitled The Essential Handbook of Women's Sexuality, and we can see the picture, hopefully. And this is put on by Prager, and in the 2nd volume, there's a chapter on Latina sexualities in the plural, which I had the privilege of authoring. And I would encourage you to examine the series, have your bookstores order it, your libraries order it, because it's a great resource where women's sexuality is viewed in a healthy, whole way. It is not problematized. The focus isn't only on Latinas' reproductive rates, but rather what, as family members, as community members, as educators, as healers, we can do to promote the healing of these historical legacies of sexual abuse that Latinas and other women of color carry. Because in order to get rooted into who we are in a holistic way and to help the next generation of men and women grow into healthy adults, we need to have come to terms with our own sexualities and our own understanding of our bodies and their connection to our minds and our spirits. So when we think about healing Latinas, and as we move on to that slide, it's the focus as educators, as family members, as mental health providers, clearly ought to be in gaining and creating balance for ourselves so that we can mentor those with whom we come in contact. And how, as wounded healers that many of our as wounded educators, how can we begin to reconnect and find balance in our lives so that we can appropriately mentor others? That is collective work. And I firmly believe that we can do it. We can do it collectively by having conversations like this one. In each woman's life, in her own world, to feel entitled to set limits, to say no, to think of herself, to put herself in the equation. And this is sometimes difficult work to do with women clients, because often when they do that, people in their family or in their community, their peer system, will begin to label them as selfish, will begin to think that they're too individualistic, that they're overly acculturated. But when we think of health in a holistic manner, if a woman doesn't take care of herself, she cannot parent, she cannot nurture as well as she could if she takes care of herself. And setting limits is very, very important. And to do that, women need to find allies on the path. We need to learn how to acknowledge our needs as women and to name the injustices that have been perpetrated against us in order to be able to heal from them and to move forward and to present more appropriate models. The motto of my generation was that the revolution begins at home. And so as we think about Latino families and as we work with Latino families, it's important to understand the cultural context of each individual family. It is equally important to understand the individual psychological needs of the people in that family. And as the expected heart of the family, we need to prioritize the position and the needs and the health of women within family systems. It is our charge, our ethical charge, to create a better context for the next generation that comes, to identify the teachable moments in our work when we can support women in their struggles to gain balance, to become more rooted, to become more connected to the past, but not to focus on the suffering on the path, but rather to identify the cultural strengths and cultural resources that allowed and facilitated the survival of the women who came before them. Every family has women who pasaron desapercibidas. It seemed that people didn't even know their existence, but their stories are there. We need to recapture those stories of the women who came before us, because inherent in those stories are powerful lessons of survival. I very humbly offer to you a book that I recently authored that just came out in March, in which I've asked permission to share with you and with whoever reads it what I have learned over the last 30 plus years of being in the mental health profession. And the book is, you can find it on Amazon. You can also have your bookstore order it, your small town bookstore. It would be great to support them. It's published by the University of Arizona Press, and which I found to be particularly ironic that the University of Arizona Press has the Mexican American Experience series, while the state of Arizona bans books on Chicanos and Mexicanos and Latinos and indigenous people. To close, I would just like to once again thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. And I give thanks to the Creator for giving us all the strength to do the work that I do.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. You know, as you were talking, I was flashing on my grandma, and my mom, my sisters, and even my daughter, and you know, it just brings to mind, you know, the otro yo, the other side. But as you were talking about, you said sometimes, you know, immigrant families, we don't get the opportunity to begin to understand and to deal with things, and so when our daughters then grow up, we're not sure how to deal with it. And I'll just tell you from my perspective, you know, as a father, that you know, I got scared when my daughter became, you know, started becoming of age, because I was not sure. I had not seen how to be with a daughter, and it stirred when she says, "Hey, Dad, I want to go out, and this guy's going to take me out." It was you know, this fear came in me, and I was wondering, where did this come from? You know, I mean, now I know that, you know, there's some genetic memory, some genetic fear, some generational stuff going on there, but you know, but without that awareness, you know, what do parents do, and how do they get stuck, and how do they pass on either the sometimes the baggage unknowingly, you know, and so I think that this is important, this dialogue and this awareness, and us being able to open up the dialogue to all of us, and especially the mental health practitioners that see families, that see a lot of adolescent young girls that supposedly are acting out or getting in trouble or depressed or whatever the symptomatology is. Underneath that, many times, as you mentioned early on, is the whole relationship aspect. So I really appreciate, you know, you opening various avenues of, you know, of thought, so that we can begin to explore this, and it should be an essential part of what any practitioner, anyone that's working with familias consider.
Thank you, Jerry. I agree, and I think that as the Latino population ages, because there are a number of us who are baby boomers too, it creates an opportunity for those of us, particularly elders in the field, to emphasize the importance of the storytelling, which you so masterfully and beautifully and sensitively do, because that's one of the ways in which the younger generations can get this history that they're not getting in the schools, that is not in the books, and that they need in order to feel that they belong on this land, to feel that they're entitled to all of the riches that this land can offer us, and to strengthen their spirit so that they can take on the challenges that are going to come, because they're going to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and Dr. Flores will be available at the end of the webinar for questions. If people have questions, she'll be available to answer those questions. I want to thank you once again. now we're going to move on to el otro yo. We say en la quech, the other side, the duality, and we know life is about that duality, about that male-female spirit. And so very, very glad and honored to share today is compadre, great friend, colleague of mine that's been on this road for a long time as well. We've been attempting, for many, many years to trying to find that balance with men and boys, and and I see Dr. Carillo, really one of the pioneers in this area as well, and really blessed and pleased that you can join us today. Ricardo, you got palabra.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Yvette, for that wonderful presentation. Always so eloquent and clear about the issues, mental health issues. And I want to say that what we're attempting to share with you today, my presentation is not my presentation. My presentation is the culmination and collaboration of many men in the United States, in Mexico, and Central America, in the Caribbean, that have been attempting to gather for a long time. The Compadres Network has been doing this work for 25 years, and we have learned just a little bit about what really happens to us as men. And so this is what I'm going to share today, is really more of the storytelling that the men have brought to us in Círculo. We've been meeting in Círculo for 25 years. Círculo is it's not a therapy, but it's therapeutic. It is not religious, but it is spiritual. And the beginning of all of our work begins with a prayer. So I want to offer a prayer as we begin today, an African prayer that says, we pray for the children that have a long way to walk. We pray for the elders that have walked a long way. And we pray for us that have to take care of them both. And so when we're born into a family that appreciates us, that loves us, that cares for us, that understands that we are in fact a blessing, you develop a security about yourself. You know life is good, and you fit in the world. Tienes un lugar. You have a sacred purpose in life. And as a result of that, you learn values that really help you respect, and you develop dignity, and you understand the word confianza. You understand having trust. You're trustworthy. And when it's given with affection, you understand that. You understand the notion that we call Carillo. And so you are raised in a very good way, in a very blessed way, in a very secure way. And that really sets the foundation for you to be able to have what Yvette and Jerry have been talking about, which is relationships and interdependence, a way in which people can connect, appreciate, value, honor each other. But when you're raised in situations when you don't receive these gifts, you are raised in an environment where caretakers, your parents, aren't available to be present, can't give you what you need, are poverty-stricken, have not been available for whatever reason, then we run into difficulties in terms of not having the foundation, and we begin to develop ways of relating to each other that really are based on our fear-based living. They're traumatic. We are raised scared. And a lot of the difficulties that Latino men suffer in this environment, and I have worked for many years. I'm a psychologist for 30 years, and I've worked in state prisons. I've worked in psychiatric hospitals, in outpatient clinics, in juvenile halls, in the community. And I've seen our people, many of them, come into treatment, come into consultation, come into looking for some assistance because they're living in this way. The important thing about understanding, folks, is that there is a foundation, and the foundation of living in a secure way is based on having people available to you that are interconnected. We know that in the current psychological theory of attachment, that our central nervous system will develop appropriately and correctly if we are touched, if we are held, if we are attended to. Attachment theory says to us when we're raised and we have a secure attachment, I see you, I understand you, and I'll take care of you. I'll love you. I'll be there for you. And that allows us to have a regulation of affect. It's a very beautiful thing when I see my grandchildren, my grandson, who says to me, Mijo, do you want to go play? And he gets so excited, his eyes light up. Yeah, Grandpa, I want to go play. And we get to the park, and unfortunately, the slides aren't working that day. The swings are under construction, and my grandson says, you know, Grandpa, I'm mad, I'm angry. Why, Mijo? Well, I wanted to play with you, and the slides aren't working. And so he's upset, and then we fantasize and play Pirates of the Caribbean with some sticks, and very quickly he moves into that play time, and then it's time to go, Mijo. And you know how children are. Their shoulders go down, and the eyes get sad, and they get very quiet. And then on the way home, we stop someplace and get him an ice cream, and he says, you know what, Grandpa? I had a nice time with you today. And so that is really an example of regulation of affect. When we have security in our relationships and people love us, we can do that. We have that kind of flexibility to experience all of the rainbow and all of everything in our repertoire of emotion. And so, unfortunately, many of our people have been traumatized. They've suffered. And so attachment theory isn't appropriate for folks when you're raised in environments where there's abuse, abandonment, violence, war-torn situations, because now the regulation of affect isn't available. Now people are frozen in their psychology and in their perception and the way they see the world because they're living in fear. They are hyper-aroused. They're having nightmares. They're being attacked, whether it's perceived or whether it's real. For many of our people, whether they're children, adolescents, adult men, immigrants, we have experienced a significant amount of trauma, let alone the fact that we talked about intergenerational trauma, the kind of trauma that people experience in their host countries given the context of the colonialization. We're talking about situations that repeatedly happen. So they affect our functioning, and we're living not in the cortex, not in the ability to have emotion and compassion and empathy, but we're living in a survival mode. The limbic system is what's hyper-aroused. So the intent here is for us as mental health practitioners to understand theory, understand attachment, and understand where our folks might be. So part of our assessment strategies, our understanding, and we will speak briefly about that. Our process to understand people is not a diagnostic nomenclature or a way to look at somebody in a label form, but really to try to make some sense out of who are you, el conocimiento. And in that conocimiento, I get to know whether my client, my compadre, is suffering from limitations in his attachment style. So just like Yvette was eloquent in explaining the issues for women, men come with these difficulties. Many men that have migrated to this country have migrated under situations historically. We can go back, to the 19th century, La Revolución de Mexico, people coming over, the Bracero movement, all kinds of different ways. These days we've got people coming from Central America that are evading and avoiding war-torn situations, repression, discrimination, targeted. Their lives are being targeted because of the war and the repressive that's happened there. And then they're violated coming across the borders and then ultimately coming to the United States. So we're talking about complex trauma. We're talking about people that have, for this generation, the generation before that, have experienced civil wars, have experienced horrendous psychological war-torn trauma that they bring with them. Our people, our young people, are the military. If you take a look at the military in the United States, the people that are serving are poor whites, Latinos, African Americans, some Asians, certainly lots of Filipinos, people that have come and migrated and believe in this country are serving the country. My children are all involved in the military, and I've seen the impact of multiple deployments on folks. And the same grief and loss and abandonment and neglect and unavailability happens when people are incarcerated. We know the statistics that our prisons and juvenile detention centers are filled with young men, young black and brown men. Living in the barrio, living in the ghetto, here in Oakland, we have the highest rate of robberies and homicides on the West Coast, and it's not getting any better. And so when people live together and they have already been accustomed to being poverty-stricken and having to fight for everything, and you have weapons around, people are traumatized. So I'm working with people that are repeatedly traumatized. The level of discrimination has to be taken into consideration because of the lack of employment, the lack of opportunity, the lack of availability, and the lack of services, the lack of culturally relevant social services and mental health services for people that come in need. And so we're lucky to have people like Yvette, the Compadres Network, La Clínica de la Raza, Instituto Familiar de la Raza, La Frontera, El Centro, programs that have focused in on attempting to be language-specific, culturally relevant, and embracing. And I think that's really what we need to talk about is what do men need? And what men need is to have an availability to have people be present and available to them. And I want to use my time efficiently, and I want you to hear some of the stories that some of our men have done. So let me just share one of these two vignettes. There is I worked with a Oaxaqueño, a Mexican immigrant who came here to work. And he came into therapy because him and his significant other were having difficulties. He had already been unfaithful one time in the relationship, had been chemically dependent, was alcoholic, using a little bit of cocaine. And really in the assessment of understanding who he was, came to see that his attachment was significantly impaired. He suffered from a dismissing attachment style. He had been raped as a young boy, had never told anybody about that, was homeless, abandoned by both his mother and father. Mother was very limited intellectually and wasn't able to be available to him. So he lived on the streets and found a way to survive by fighting for himself. So he's a fighter. He comes in and he's fighting. He's domestically violent, he's chemically dependent, and more than anything else, he's lost. He doesn't know who he is, doesn't know where he's at. So perfect situation for explaining what it is that people need. What he needed was somebody to embrace him, somebody to be available to him, somebody to hold him and say, you know what, you need to do a lot more work than just you and this lady friend. So that relationship ended for him. And he worked together with me for about 2.5 years. And in those 2.5 years, he identified what it was that his wounds were, where he was traumatized, how the trauma affected the way he saw himself and he saw other people. And little by little, he began to find that if he worked with jewelry, if he worked with seeds, if he worked with gems, he could make some balance of his life. He could find some way to connect and do it in a very concrete way. He responded to the idea that maybe the 4 elements required his attention, the fire that he carried inside, the water that he needed to stay away from the alcohol, the breath that he needed to breathe and understand, and that sometimes his head was up in the clouds and he needed to be firmly planted on Mother Earth. And so he began to develop relationships with the elements. He began to have prayer time for himself. He began to have some meditative quality, and he put all of his energy into his work, his artwork. And now he's running his own business. He's looks like he's going to marry an American gal and get his citizenship attended to. But more important than anything else, he's a very active member in our San Jose Círculo. So what I want to do is I want to share with you.
Ricardo, let me just because I'd like to just you know, the case that you just shared really is a beautiful example of, because you mentioned embracing, and nothing in your presentation had anything to do with shame or guilt or anything like that, but embracing. And I think that when you talk about attachment, attachment issues, that when someone has not had a connection, that how important it is for somebody that's working with you to accept you, to acknowledge you and accept you with the regalos that you have, that you're able to bring out of him, but also the tremendous amount of generational struggle and the circumstantial issues that have affected his life, that then has impaired him. And I think it's a beautiful example of that, of embracing the baggage without shaming him, making him accountable, but at the same time then attempting to help him to build on his gifts, and allowing him then to flourish in terms of making things with his hands.
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing, and we've done that when we do national trainings here in Nigeria, is we try to get people to understand, how is it that you're a blessing, and from a clinical perspective, are you going to be available? Are you the one? Are you the one clinically that somebody who comes in to see you can count on, can share with you the trauma, the pain, the shame, the guilt, the vergüenza, whatever it is that they're experiencing without that judgment? And I think one of the things for Latino men is no tenemos lugar. We don't have a place. We don't have a place in our pueblito or provincia allá in Mexico or Central America. We come to look for work, and how many jornaleros are on the street, looking for work because there's just not any other way to provide for their families, and they make that sacrifice, and they come over here and they leave their children, they leave their significant others, their mothers, their daughters, they leave the familia here in hopes of making life better. So they're displaced, and Samuelina Martinez will talk next week about being deslocado. That's what drives us crazy, the disconnection. And this is just normal migration, let alone add war-torn situations on to that where you didn't even fit in your family of origin, or you come from a country where brothers fought against each other, and so and you haven't had an opportunity to process that or understand it. So I think it's crucial that we give men their place, that we understand them, and I think conocimiento is crucial for us to do that. Really get to understand who this person is, what's their story, how they got here, how their family life, and Yvette and I have done intergenerational work of the families. We can move on, where we really understand the family patterns of the kind of abandonment, neglect, abuse, chemical dependency, how it impacts somebody else. And so the history of the family, the history of the colonialization impact how we see ourselves and how they see themselves. So that then now men can choose, do I want to continue to be chemically dependent, domestically violent, and abandoning my kids? Do I really want to do the same thing that my father did to me or that my grandfather did to me? And so I get an opportunity to see that. I do my intergenerational, and I hear the stories, and what do I want my story to be? My story, and I'm talking personally, my story is in my family life of 3 generations of alcoholics, 3 generations of domestic violence perpetrators. That stops, that legacy stops with me, in my sobriety, in my willingness to arrest those destructive patterns that have been part of my family. How they got there? Sure, colonialization, sure, socialization, monkey see, monkey do, early learning practices, lots of reinforcement, beliefs, distorted beliefs that Latino men are mujeriegos, paranderos, jugadores, that we're unfaithful, that we're drunks, that we're not available. Those perceptions we have to arrest. We have to take responsibility for that so that we can see just how it is that we want to be in our families. And so we also have to take into account the impact of acculturation. And Cuco will talk about the impact of Latino mental health and how it is that the more we become like the rest of the population, the more disturbed, the iller we become, less healthy we become. We start eating fast food, processed foods. We're moving around too much. We're so busy we can't spend time with our families. And then we wonder why our children say to you, oh, now you want to be my dad? Now you want to talk to me? Where have you been? Because you haven't been here. You've been working 2 or 3 jobs. And so we have to earn that. We have to take responsibility for that. How can we make ourselves present and available? And that's how we can define for ourselves this notion of cargas and regalos. What carga do I have? What baggage do I have? Where do I leave it? And we teach men how to leave it in the fire. We teach them to pay attention to things that are important to them, that really they believe is important, of those old values when you were born, when you were told that you were a blessing. So, and that's how we really appreciate the regalos. And what I want to do as we close my part of this presentation is I want to share with you the impact of what happens when men come and they get the understanding that it's possible to leave the carga. These are a couple of vignettes from our compadres over the 20 years that we've been working, 25 years that we've been working with them. The first one is Jaime. Jaime is a very, very important case.
Yeah, these vignettes are taken at the annual retiro that we do, and this was the 20th year of us gathering, and we asked permission of these men to share their story. And this was after a couple of days of gathering and of doing ceremony and sharing cargas and regalos and doing all of that. And here's a couple of the oh, wait a minute. Let's see. We can get this to work. Okay. Technical issues there.
Well, just so you understand, Jaime comes to us after having lived his entire life incarcerated, shot caller for a Sureño group down in Southern California, struggling to be a better father. He wants to be a father. His wife is in drug and alcohol treatment, and we invite him to join us. And this is his first really connection with other men in a healing way, and hopefully we can get his perception.
Yeah, we can't get this. I don't know if they can. You guys can help me on it then. See if we can.
Yeah, just momentarily, we'll go ahead and get that rolling.
Okay. All right. So, and just to share that you know, we started 25 years ago. A number of men gathered because we were very distressed by what was going on in our community, and especially as men, as Chicano, Latino, Native men, we were very distressed that we were hurting a lot of our families and hurting a lot of our children, and so we decided to come together and gather. And Ricardo and I called to a bunch of other men, and at that time it was kind of a new thing. People could not understand why men would want to gather. What are we gathering for? If we're not going to drink, we're not going to party, how can? But we did, and that became a whole process of healing and development. And we have circulos all across the country, and we've been gathering now for more than 25 years in this way. And so we're trying to see if we can show this clip here.
It's been a very, very good experience for me. Helped me see things like family values between men. You know, I've never thought that. I've never been around. I never thought it was okay to hug another man, and you know, I seen a father kiss his son. You know, and those are just things I've never seen before, and it blew my mind. And I see how much love and how strong their bonds are, and that's something I've always wanted because I never had a father. It wasn't because he wasn't around or because he was deadbeat. It was just because he died when I was 2. And that's what I want to give my kids. That I want to have that kind of relationship. Started going to these conferences, and I met these men there. And I remember my first experience meeting these men, the homeless, right? People of the homeless. And I remember one man in particular, Flores, who would talk about his wife. Different way than I had observed other men talking about their parejas, you know, and talking about things and sacredness and men and palabra and all these different concepts that relatively new to me. And like I said, if those other hombres that were living in the, kind of living in darkness and in the shadows were a mirror to me, and those jovencitos that I saw in my barrio, those other young men, were a mirror to me. These men also looked like me, but they were talking in a different way. They didn't talk the way I was accustomed to hearing men talk. They talked in a very respectful and dignified manner, and they talked about things that were important that I was a little bit kind of scared to talk about things like that, you know, because it was so new. And I remember looking at somebody next to me, an older guy. We're sitting in the circle, and he's talking about his wife, Lucy, and he's talking about just the community, and all these different things are going on. And they're talking about things that I was so touched by it, but it seemed so unreal to me. I said, is this for real, you know? And I remember looking to my left at somebody and saying, these guys are weird, man. Aren't these guys weird? And he looked at me, and with a tear in his eye, he said, that's the way we're supposed to be. And that was my, that's the way we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be good men. And I said, well, I can probably be a good man, no? And so that began my road in my introduction to the Círculo de Hombres. It's been just a beautiful gift to me and my family. It's been a
Hold on, I have to give him back the presenter.
Tammy now leads a tremendous organization in Stockton, and has become, you know, really an advocate and a teacher and a leader in terms of healing and communities, and doing a wonderful job there in Stockton. But he also is part of the Compadres Network and one of the great consultants and teachers as well. But these two are examples, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, Ricardo.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up by saying this is what we've had the privilege to be part of, to watch men come with their baggage, come with their carga, leave it in the fireplace, take responsibility. This is a shot caller from a gang in Southern California. That's all he knows is prison. All he knows is methamphetamine. All he knows is violence. And he's willing to turn it over. He's willing to accept a different lifestyle because there are men around him that can hold him, that can embrace him, that don't judge him, that help him find his place. Not our place, his place. Finds his place in the world so that he can arrest what he's been living with all of his life. So thank you for the opportunity to compartir, to share with you, and you know, we invite men to come to our retreats. We invite men to participate in our circles and to continue to do the healing necessary. Él es Dios.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I just want to mention, you know, also Ricardo and I co-authored a book in terms of healing men as well, and men of many different cultures. We co-authored with a whole number of other authors from different ethnic backgrounds as well. You want to mention that title, Ricardo?
Yeah, the book is Family Violence and Men of Color. We have two separate publications. The last one's 2010, Springer Publishing Company, and you can find that on Amazon.com.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to move on to one of our other compadres here, and who met a long time ago in Santa Barbara. He was running programs there, and now is also one of the leaders in community and teachers, but also, you know, works in the mental health system as well, and is helping to guide some of the movement there. And a wonderful father, you know, blessed to you know, really know his family and see him. And I think the you know, the best credential you can have is children that love you, and so I've seen the love that his children have for him. So real blessed to have Refugio Rodriguez. We call him Cuco. And so Cuco, we're going to turn the palabra over to you.
Well, thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to be in such good company of the presenters that are here. So I think, as Jerry said, I actually currently work for County Mental Health here in Santa Barbara County as the Mental Health Services Act Division Chief and the Cultural Competency Manager. But prior to this, I did a lot of work in the nonprofit side, and actually one of my first trainers and teachers was Jerry in kind of doing this work with adolescent young men and incarcerated men in general. So what I'm going to give you is, if we can move forward to the next slide, I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the things that some of the barriers, I think, that our community faces when it comes to mental health treatment, and more importantly, treatment that is relevant to their reality. And again, I'm not saying that there's obviously a lot more to this, but these are some kind of key areas that we've identified over, you know, the last 16 or 15, 16 years in working with these populations. Again, you know, as I indicated, I work with the Mental Health Services Act. And the Mental Health Services Act, one of the things that attracted me to this position was the mere fact that a lot of what is identified in the Act in terms of its principles is directly related to populations that have minimal services or are what are called unserved populations. And when you look at a lot of the intent of the Act, it was really intended to serve populations who were receiving very minimal services or no services at all. So for someone like me, that really spoke to me in terms of my community and other communities that are unserved or not served at all. So I kind of went into this endeavor, and one of the things that struck me is that statewide, our own internal local county systems created structures that prevented services to these populations that were unserved. And by that I mean, you know, our own county bureaucracies that prevented services to undocumented or uninsured populations. So despite the fact that here we had a funding stream that provided the flexibility that didn't exist in our existing Medi-Cal funding opportunities, instead of allowing that flexibility to afford, you know, to help us serve and do creative things, our own bureaucratic process kind of prevented us from doing that. So I think I want to point out that that's really one of the examples that I have, that our system is really so ingrained in kind of its own process, and in more of a cookie cutter kind of approach to things, is that we don't even realize that within our own system it goes beyond just saying that we want to expand services to certain populations. We really have to evaluate policies and have to evaluate our structure, and how sometimes even programs, or even funding in this case, that are intended to serve populations, it doesn't happen because our own bureaucratic process prevents that from happening, either through policies or through perceptions. And what I mean by that is that, you know, even I think in the last probably 18 years that I worked in this field, the social political perspectives that kind of have been permeated into the work that we do is very striking to me. And what I mean by that is that this idea that when I started doing this work, I don't recall at any time during either my education and my training there being any discussion about exclusionary factors in populations. And in the last probably 10 years, we've seen this shift where people feel comfortable, I think, kind of inserting their own perceptions around services to, let's say, undocumented populations. Say, well, this is, they're illegal, why do we provide services? I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard that in the last 8 or 9 years that I've been working in mental health. And I think that, again, professionally, that was never the intent of why most of us came into this work. Not to look at exclusionary factors. We're trying to be more asset-based. But again, to me, policies that are in place prevent, I think, access to populations. And again, the allowance of, when we create those policies, it allows for these perceptions also that also create, again, local or on-the-ground level barriers for people to access services. The other, I think, real challenge that I've seen that our systems face is that, when it comes right down to it, when I used to work with child welfare services as a partner, there was this concept called differential response. And the concept of differential response is that you have basically different levels of treatment approaches for people. That there's a variety of, or a menu of types of services based on kind of where people are at. Some of them are voluntary, some may be, it varies. Some are not voluntary. But again, there's a differential treatment approach. From a cultural competency standpoint, when we look at our systems, really, we don't have a differential treatment approach. I mean, we are at a place where we talk about evidence-based practices, for examples, but neglect the fact that the majority of evidence-based practices have not been tested on communities of color or Latinos. I mean, in general, and specifically Latino communities. And that's what I mean by a differential treatment approach, which is, and that's kind of really been the focus of this presentation, which is how do we include some culturally recognizable approaches to to different communities, just in this case, Latino communities. In most cases, we don't even have a specific ethnic-specific assessments, again, which is very, very critical because that will help you at least identify those differences or those values that might be assets or those items within, again, the individuals that we're working with that might be deficits, if we so choose to label them that way. But more importantly, identifying those assets is very key. And again, most of our systems lack even ethnic-specific assessments. And the final thing that I want to point out is that, to me, we have moved in our system to this whole electronic health record system. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of counties have done that, and we're probably at a variety of different places within that process. One of the things that struck me is that, as I said before, I was from the Ethnic Services or Cultural Competency Manager for our department. We were on a conference call one time, and we were talking about expanding or trying to develop an ethics-specific assessment, and a very large county indicated that their electronic health record system did not have the capacity to accommodate that specific need. And more importantly, the system that that county was utilizing is being utilized through many counties in the state. So here we have, again, an electronic health record system that does not have the capacity to allow us to grow in the development of an ethnic-specific assessment and collect ethnic-specific data in that respect. It's very telling in terms of the way that we prioritize something as important as data collection. And more importantly, the significant investment that we have made in electronic health record systems. And again, there's been absolutely no consideration made to ethnic-specific issues. And again, it creates a significant capacity problem. We would never, go ahead.
I think what you're stating really is the major issue, that the systems and the therapeutic interventions and the approaches, and you even went into how educational institutions prepare you or don't prepare you for doing your work, are not ready for the multidimensional aspects of ethnic population, and specifically when we talk about Chicano, Latino, Native populations. We in the last webinar talked about the whole multicultural aspect of our identity, the whole differences. Yvette and Ricardo just talked about the different levels of trauma, generational trauma, a whole number of things that have no place in terms of consideration presently in our system. And if we're using our ability to track and document as the basis for either accepting something or not accepting something, then are we if we're talking about cargos and regalos, are we an asset to somebody's mental health or a population's mental health, or are we more a barrier? And I think that's exactly what you're pointing to.
Yeah, and more importantly, I think a lot of us that have been doing this, for some time realize that the challenge or the dilemma that we find ourselves in is when we are requesting services that look a different way, or we're requesting any change in the way that we do things. The first response is, do you have data? And here we have a situation where it's kind of a catch-22. We have, again, a dependence on a system that everybody is utilizing, but there is absolutely no way of collecting significant data that's important to us to justify the existence of different approaches. Yeah. So it kind of creates a catch-22 for us. So if we can move on to the next slide.
Oops, I'm sorry. Oh.
Okay. One of the other systemic issues I think that impedes treatment for our community is that, and certainly again, I'll refer back to MHSA because that's one of the largest initiatives with, and if you don't know anything about the Mental Health Services Act, it's probably the largest influx of funding to the state of California for mental health services prior, and even then challenging, I would say, in size, short oil Medi-Cal. It's huge. It is significant. And the one thing that amazes me is that we initiated that effort at the state and local levels with this idea that all communities have the same understanding of mental health, and that all communities have the same level of structures. And more importantly, that stigma is the same across all communities, when clearly we know that it is not. And again, in our community, we are at a place in terms of the level of stigma where mental health was probably in this country 15 or 20 years ago. Just to give people a kind of an accurate picture of what this is, and not only in Latino communities, but in other communities as well. In many of our communities, because of our experiences and because of our lack of resources, we define mental health system in its extreme form, which is being what we call locura, being crazy. So any other form of if it's mild depression, whatever that is, you will see a resistance to the acknowledgement that it is a mental health issue. It is something else. It will be physical. There'll be, all sorts of different ways, but there is a resistance to acknowledging that it is a mental health issue. And again, primarily because we view it very differently, and because of our experience. So the reason I point that out is that if we are going to develop effective approaches in our communities and across the state, we really have to engage many Latino communities as well as other communities, provide outreach and provide education so that we both understand that we're talking about the same thing, or that we are providing information about when we say mental health, what we truly mean by that. Because right now, we are having two very different conversations, and our community is certainly reluctant to even come in for services because of the level of stigma that exists. I think the other significant, oversight of our system.
Let me mention
yeah, go ahead.
Because I think since we're talking about the generational trauma, I think what a lot of people don't know is that historically, under colonialism and a lot of the oppressive ways, is the oppressor looked for any reason to separate you from your family, to lock you up, or to kill you. And one of those reasons is if you're crazy. If you're seen as crazy, you're disconnected from your family, you were locked up, you were put in someplace else, or you were killed. So that stigma carried a heavy amount of impact on you as an individual, but on your family as well.
Correct.
And especially when we're talking about what Ricardo talked about in terms of attachment or detachment, the significant trauma that happened generationally that becomes a trigger for you. That when you're seen as loco or estás loco or you're crazy, what does that mean? You no longer, I mean, and it happens. It happens. If you're diagnosed that way and are seen as, insufficient to or harm to yourself or others, you can be locked away. You can be taken away here. And if you don't have the language to help yourself, or don't have a lawyer, or don't have any advocate, it goes on today. And especially if you come from an indigenous culture and don't even speak English or Spanish, I mean, worse. So I think there's a tremendous amount of weight that people don't understand or history related to this. It's not just because we're unaware. It's not just because we don't know what mental health is, and so you come out and define it, and, well, this is mental health. No. It really comes with some generational historical things that is connected to racism and oppression as well. And so that's,
and let me give you a perfect example of how this plays out for our clients. I work with a lot of single mothers, Latina single mothers, who may be documented or undocumented, but the fear is still the same in terms of why they do not access mental health services. And the number one fear that they have is that they feel, the perception is that if they are diagnosed with a mental health issue, that they will lose custody of their children. And again, that's not true, but their experience has taught them exactly what you're pointing out. So even though they acknowledge that they have a mental health issue, they avoid services because of that fear of loss over their children.
Yeah.
So it is not uncommon to have single mothers who go without treatment for a very long time until it becomes a critical mental health issue. They end up in the ER or in our crisis system, but again, it plays out that way. At the same time, I mean, you see this protectiveness about family. And to me, that's important because, we value one of these other factors that really we have to confront is the fact that our system puts a lot of value, our society puts a lot of value. But we've designed our mental health system around this issue. Client-centered, it's very individualized, it's, this focus on independence, and which is wonderful. But what if you come from a community that is not about the individual? What if you come from a community that is about interdependence, about collectivism? And one of the challenges that our community, as well as other communities of color, face is that when they come into a system, they come wanting not independence. They want interdependence. And what we've heard from a lot of our Latino clients is, I don't seek independence. I feel that I am now independent because my family has isolated me. No one depends on me as they once were or did before I was mentally ill. I want to get to a place of healing where my family depends on me as they depended on me before, that I'm part of this family structure. I know what it is to feel independent, and it's lonely. And again, that's, to me, one of the biggest systemic barriers that we have within our system that we have not confronted, is that for many of our communities, we are about interdependence, and that's not necessarily congruent with the modes of interventions that we are providing for people. More importantly, when we begin to include family, the way Latino communities and other communities define family is a lot broader than, husband, wife, and 2.5 children. So it provides additional challenges for our system. And again, finally, what's working in our system? I mean, I think the point is we have a lot of examples. Promotoras are certainly one component. And I think you've heard Jerry and Ricardo and Yvette talk a little bit about, La Cultura Cura and some of the other interventions that National Compadres Network is providing, as well as, the work that I did with, and you heard Sammy around Joven Noble, working with high-risk Latino males, kind of redefining the concepts of manhood. You certainly heard the distortions that some folks shared and why, the young man was saying that baffled me, that I saw something different than what I had in mind. And that's really some of the work that we've been doing for a very long time. But more importantly, I think that the fundamental The real important takeaway here is that for me, what's working in our system are interventions that have a deep understanding of the communities that we're working with, in this case Latino communities, and have the ability and the expertise to identify the difference between those things that we should consider assets and those things that we should consider deficits that exist within populations, or problems or solutions that we have to resolve. And I can tell you right now, I don't think overall our mental health system can differentiate that difference. And that's why there's a significant need right now to develop those interventions that are recognizable by the community, not just by mental health, but that the community understands what it is that we're bringing to the table. Because in all honesty right now, it isn't very clear to me whether or not, I think our community, our Latino community, is still deciding whether or not these services are for them. And I think that, to me, that's a real important juncture to be at in terms of community mental health, that we really have to come to grips with. Jerry?
Yes.
Anything you want to add? Or?
Well, no, I just, I think what you mentioned is so significant in terms of, and it really, last week we talked about identity, and that the first lesson for me with my parents was acknowledgement. We were told that when you go in somebody's house, you got to acknowledge everybody, kiss and hug everybody. When somebody comes to your house, you tienes que, levantarse, get there and acknowledge them. And when we go places, we have to greet, just that acknowledgement. And that becomes, if you don't have that, that's that first lesson in life. We go back to that first lesson in life. Are you a blessing? Are you wanted? And I think that's the question that as a population we're struggling with. Are we seen? Ricardo mentioned, do I see you? Are you the one? Do people see us, to really see us in who we really are? And I think there's been such a dichotomy in terms of the discussion and trying to fit us in to, if you will, evidence-based practice, or even a model of looking. And the way we've looked at really dealing with, if you will, minority or ethnic populations has been really a black-white paradigm, looking from an African-American point of view, or from a European Western point of view, and the point of view of other populations is kind of layered on that. And I think what systems have done is attempted to do a quick fix, and so they take materials. You talk about outreach and education, take materials and we translate them, right? And they just translate, and so they're linguistically understandable, maybe, but in terms of cultural base, in terms of value base, in terms of spiritual base, they're not, and sometimes they cause more confusion. And so we then provide bilingual translators, but we train the translators and we train the providers in a Western way of looking at this. And so basically it becomes more confusion. And again, in the digressionary scale, the first thing is confusion. So you get somebody that looks like you, that speaks your language, but is telling you something or treating you or giving an intervention that feels weird. It doesn't feel right. And it doesn't help you. It doesn't help you in terms of your balance. And I think so the systemic shift has to be significant, and especially when we look at the demographic trends here. We look at the demographic numbers, especially in California, and look at the numbers, young children. If we really want to deal right with the population, we're increasing at a significant number. I saw a number yesterday on the other side that we now have more Latinos in federal prison than any population. We've surpassed any other population. And so, from the other side, and now a lot of those men are coming out. And many of them, as we mentioned in our last webinar, have been misdiagnosed. A lot of them have mental health issues. But where do they go? Where do they go for treatment and what? So I think, the things that you're mentioning systemically are very significant, that really need to be addressed, and that organizations that get funding, need to consider the capacity building that they need to do. Any last comments, Cuco? You want to?
No, I just want to thank everybody. And again, I think that Jerry points to, I think, the significant issues just in sheer population and where we are at, and unfortunately how much further we have to go. Again, there are a lot of successes, but I think in its totality, there is not one county in this state that is not touched by the large number of Latinos, and we are, again, only beginning to scratch the surface in terms of how we deal with mental health, and more importantly, identifying the internal cultural assets that we can utilize to resolve some of these mental health issues, which again is I think the imperative for us to look at culturally based approaches that could help identify those. Thank you all very much.
Mental health is one area, but also the educational institutions and juvenile justice institutions, health institutions as well. All those entities that have and you have children in school as well, so I'm sure you see it as a father, in terms of trying to guide your children in a good way, sometimes in systems that don't have that understanding either.
Correct, and I think that doing this work without children is one thing, and having to apply even at the level of kind of the work that we do, applying it within your own kids and having to confront some of these issues is a little bit. It becomes very real. Some of the issues that we dealt with early on that now we're dealing with our kids that I thought were gone, and having to come to the realization that they're still very much alive in relation to discrimination, in relationship to prejudice, a lot of these things. And yet they looked a little bit different than they did when I was a child, but somehow it's evolved and it has survived. So, and again, that is someone who, my wife and I both work in systems and understand and can, we're bilingual and bicultural, and we still have a challenge, let alone a lot of our monolingual and indigenous communities trying to confront some of these issues.
Well, thank you, Cuco. Hopefully you can stay around for some any questions that come. What I do want to do is kind of summarize a little bit about what's been shared, and we've specifically chosen to talk about women's and men's issues because we recognize that there sometimes are challenges that are very different, and wanted to really give lugar and give space to the reflection of the female spirit, and because we recognize that the cargas, the baggage that continue to go on, and it's another layered thing, if you will, and so that the struggles that men will go through and the struggles that women go through, and then girls and boys, and then what Yvette brought up was very significant in terms of gender identity and your own identity, the multiplicity of identities that women struggle with and that men struggle with, and finally, how do we deal with that in a system that sometimes doesn't know how to identify us even. It doesn't know, even the forms are not large enough and don't have the categories. So even we have to, sometimes we have to check Hispanic, which is, a lot of us take offense to that term, or we become another. And so I think when we're talking about the entryway of people into services, those are some systemic barriers, if you will, the systemic cargas. I think on the other hand, there have been some inroads, and there are a number of counties that are attempting to do some work. I know I mentioned last week that we're doing some work in Merced there with the county mental health system. Sharon Jones guides that over there, and there's been some work in Santa Cruz County as well. Jaime Molina and some of the work there that goes on, and we'll talk a little bit more about those next week. Also in Salinas, that the real creative work that's being done, funded under the endowment, of bringing to light the community healers as well. So, talking about the restauradores, the people that know herbs and know, we have a tremendous historical legacy of healers in our culture. that before any systems were present, we had and we still have. We still have, used probably remedios, the remedies. That we'll talk about those next week a little bit. But we want to then go to the questions and see if, Sharon, I don't know if there's any questions or any questions from the audience. I can't see them up here on my screen, but to see if there's any particular questions that people have asked.
Yeah, we have some great comments come through and questions. Let me back up. Let's see. One of the questions we had was if the book was in Spanish. This is to Dr. Flores Ortiz. She's still on with us?
I don't know if she's still on. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it is in Spanish or not. But I would imagine that it will be soon, because it's really focused at Latinas, and we recognize the bilingual nature. If I would suggest you write to Dr. Flores and ask that, but even the book in English, I think, would be is valuable.
Great. Okay. Dr. Flores is with us. We just have her on mute, so we're going to get her off mute.
Okay.
We also have someone that's raising their hand asking to make a comment, so we're trying to locate
okay.
Adriana. Adriana, can you hear us?
No, I didn't select the audio option.
Okay.
See, sometimes these systemic things get in the way of the flow. But that's
Let's try this
all
one more
part
time.
of the process, right?
Yeah, right. Adriana, are you with us? Okay, maybe not. We'll keep working to see if we can pipe Adriana in. She had a comment. Another question that came about was this is from Al DeBose. You've explained some of the barriers to fitting into an evidence-based model. Has any work been done to measure change, increase assets, or positive outcomes for participants along various domains?
Well, we definitely have evidence. One of our curriculums, Joven Noble, is an evidence-based practice. But I'll tell you, we've been doing this work for many, many years, even before it was evidence-based practice. We talk about community-based evidence as our marker, and so we have evidence on a whole number of domains, from self-concept, from stress level, from family relations, from behavioral changes, and self-worth level. So there's been many domains that we have measured, and actually if you want more information on that, Dr. Heriberto Escamilla, who's our evaluator and researcher, can talk more about that, and even the process for evaluation. But let me just state that there are many, many processes that are culturally based and they're trauma-informed and healing-centered, that there's no way you can capture and measure the movement that goes on with the spirit, the movement that goes on with some of the spiritual identity, and some of the practices are not, you can't measure them because they're not something that are that happen right away. They happen over time as well. But I think one of the things that we do see, and Dr. Carillo referred to this, is the sense of interconnectedness, of attachment. We begin to see many people that get acknowledged, so that if we look at the process of healing, the first level is acknowledgement, the second level is understanding. When you get a sense of understanding that somebody finally does embrace what my journey has been, the struggles that I've had, and it's not judging me, it's not shaming me, but somebody embraces that and makes me not feel like I'm crazy, if you will, then there begins to be some hope and change, and we've seen that over the years. So.
Yeah, let me add something to that. That's a good question, because we live in a society that is requiring evidence-based practices. Let me say that our work is practice-based evidence. And you'll hear Concha Saucedo speak about that next time, because our traditional healing approaches are empirically based. We have been observing the healing of people and the reduction of trauma symptomology for generations. Sal Nunez, who is our therapeutic drummer, Puerto Rican psychologist at City College in San Francisco, has autonomic responses, heart rate, blood pressure, stress management as a result of doing drumming in a particular way from the bomba tradition that really, in fact, does reflect using the Western approaches that it does have a significant impact. Bessel van der Kolk has explained for many years the impact of physiological and culturally relevant methodologies, the singing in South Africa, the dance approaches that our Mexica people do. It becomes a bilateral stimulation that is what EMDR is based on for the use of trauma. So we, as Jerry says, it's hard to really define all that, but there's a lot of work being done, and if we can just get out of the box a little bit and not get stuck on evidence-based practice, having somebody else validate our work, but see the validation in the benefit that people have coming through it. And of course, there's always room for more research.
Yeah, I'd like to add something, if I might. Last year, a book was published by Guillermo Bernal and Melanie Domenech Rodriguez. It's entitled Cultural Adaptations, Tools for Evidence-Based Practice with Diverse Populations. It was actually published by the American Psychological Association. And in the book, various authors talk about how the tools of measurement need to be adapted in order to adequately measure what works in our communities, rather than we having to modify what we do to fit the tools that are used for evaluation. And I think this is a step in the right direction. I think another is that there is a lot of anecdotal, qualitative, narrative evidence that needs to continually be submitted for publication, because we need to also change the paradigms of evaluation. And the work that you, Ricardo, and Jerry do is critical, and your book is outstanding, and those are the kinds of things that we need to continue to make available to the powers that be to demonstrate how measurement can take many forms.
Yvette, there was a question regarding your book, whether it was in Spanish or not.
Not yet, but if there is significant request for it, I can certainly speak to the publishers and get it translated.
Right.
That's awesome. I want to make sure we got a couple of comments in here. One coming from Haiti Kuza. Unfortunately, losing children is sometimes a consequence of mental health struggles, especially in communities of color, where children are put into foster care at a much higher rate.
Well, I think that also points to the significance of what we know that people of color get children put in foster care, get children taken away. We get young people incarcerated, higher detention rates, all of those things, and now when we layer immigration on top of that, deportation. So. And if we look to what Dr. Carillo was talking about in terms of attachment and connection, well, all of those, definitely are traumatic events that definitely impact populations, and a lot of times there's not the adequate amount of attention that is placed on the impact of those disconnections, and even the women that come over here sometimes without their families. We were at a community meeting, and a woman spoke up and says, that she had to leave Mexico to come here because her children were starving. Yes. And there was a compadre that was coming over, and he had work for her over here so her children could survive. And so she came over every year thinking she was going to go back and bring the children. And now 10 years had passed, and now her son that was 2 when she left was 12. And she said he just got here last year. And she says, but I don't know him. I don't know who he is, and how do I connect with him? And I don't know the system here because I'm afraid, and who's teaching him are the kids on the corner, and I don't want him to get into gangs. And what they and he's acting out in class, and what they're doing is they're sending him to anger management, and he doesn't understand any of it. So, you know, I mean, this is the whole aspect of detachment and what happens to our children, and what she was afraid of is exactly what Cuco said. If I go for services, they're going to take my kid away from me, and they're going to deport me. So I think, you know, the question is a very, very valid question, and something that needs to be considered when we're working with our population.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of teacher training that needs to be done as well in terms of identifying the particular needs of children who've been separated from their parents because of the massive deportations of the last few years, and the support that's needed to the familial and non-familial caregivers who are taking care of these children in the interim. And I don't see any systematic effort being done to provide support for the teachers and instruction to them of what the issues are that the children are going to be facing, which leads to mislabeling and misdiagnosing of children.
Yvette, can you speak a little bit to the impact of mothers, you know, with children that, then, you know, the accusation is often that they're inadequate, and the threat of their children being taken away or even being deported?
Absolutely, and you know, the disempowerment that's been mentioned in terms of coming to a new system, the losses that one is grieving for what was left behind. Many of immigrant women are single parents, separated from their partners for whatever reason, and to deal with systems that they do not fully understand and be labeled by these systems as being inadequate, when there are no specific criteria being given to them on what it consists, what adequate parenting is in the United States.
Yeah.
Issues of discipline, what may be considered discipline that could be viewed as constructed as abusive. You know, psychologists labeling a child parentified when he in fact is a parental child who's assisting the parents. There are multiple ways which lead to mothers feeling alone, disempowered, blamed, very often feeling very shamed because they're not doing it right despite the best efforts. And that certainly contributes to the high rates of depression and anxiety that women carry.
Jerry, I have a couple more questions that have come through and a few hands that have raised, and a few other comments. And I want to make sure that we get all these in within the next 12 minutes.
Okay.
Ron has written us and said that there's been some excellent points made from each of the speakers, and that also these presentations need to be ongoing education forums in many communities. I wanted to make sure you guys got that information. We had another great question that came from Anne Marie that was along the lines of EBPs as well. Let me see. We are aware that the EBPs are not relevant to treatment ethnically diverse populations, and staff are reluctant to conduct pre- and post-outcome measures. As a result, some are looking at other funding streams outside of MHSA to fund ethically responsive treatment interventions. How do we influence the county policy creators that we got a little freeze here, that have lost sight of the currently created practices? Anyone have a feedback for her?
Are you still on, Cuco? I don't know if Cuco's still on. Well, I think you're right. I think that what's happened is that other funding streams are coming through to address, you know, the health and mental health issues of populations, and I think that's good. I think, but you know, we've also seen some very creative ways of using the innovation dollars, mental health innovation dollars. Like I said, in Merced, you know, they've stepped up and seen the significance of providing, you know, culturally based, culturally competent services, using community partners, and creating, building on resiliency in communities. So there are flexibility in even in the mental health dollars now. It's just that communities and particular jurisdictions have to step up and recognize the need. I mean, obviously, if there's continues to be more issues among a population, then there's some distress that's going on. And I think that instead of incarcerating our youth and stigmatizing our families, we need to provide services and treatment for them.
Great. One more question, and then I'm going to turn over to Adriana and also Elizabeth Robles. But another question coming from Ron. After starting with policymakers, funding leaders, who are the next level of leaders to share this information?
Well, I think the community first of all, and I think the practitioners, because the community has a great influence on what goes on, and the community needs to recognize first of all, and that's what we're doing. We're doing a lot of capacity building with communities, but educational institutions. I mean, in terms of the schools, that Yvette mentioned, the schools is very significant because the schools really become the central point for a lot of the referrals. A lot of the referrals to the children, a lot of the referrals to parents, and they become then the central place where many of the distress is recognized and then triggers a whole lot of other things that goes on as well. But I also think there are other funding sources, and that in criminal justice systems needs to be reoriented, and again, we changing some of the criminal justice process to understand the mental health needs of populations that have multi-layers of stress is very significant. I don't know if you Ricardo, you want to?
Jerry?
Yes.
This is Cuco.
Okay.
I want to go to that question because in terms of where it needs to go and why, if it's MHSA related, it needs to go to the community, and the community needs to directly affect the process. The way MHSA works is that it is the stakeholders that drive this process, those that are being served and those that have not been served. And that's why it becomes really important that as a strategy, that's why I said early on that one of the problems that we had, or challenges that we had with MHSA, was this idea that all communities are at the same place. There is no statewide Latino or African American advocacy organization for African Americans or Latinos. There is none. There is one in for English speakers. It's called AMI. So if you don't have those kind of structures to advocate for your position, then you didn't get a seat at the table and you didn't get your issues addressed. The same thing occurs locally. Because of the level of stigma, because of the lack of organization and resources, we don't have those structures. But that doesn't mean that we can't develop them as a process. And more importantly, when it comes to MHSA, that's really what needs to be happening across all the communities, is that these communities need to be empowered to point out that these services are not relevant. And the other final point that I want to get to in terms of evidence-based practices is, by definition, an evidence-based practice only works if it is adapted to meet the cultural needs of populations. And that's the one significant piece that people continue to ignore in the implementation of evidence-based practices.
Well, and I think additionally, when a practice gets certified as evidence-based, many times the population that it was normed on is not the population that's served. So even when you do the adaptation, right there, you're invalidating the evidence-based practice. Even though it's a practice that's for general population, the factors that are very different for ethnic-centered folks. So it may be evidence-based when it's normed on a certain population, but once you change that population, the whole credibility of being an evidence-based practice changes.
Great. I wanted to get to Adriana. She's mentioning she had her hand raised and has sent us a message. Adriana, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Go ahead and with your question.
It was kind of a comment, and I hear this talk about the evidence-based practices and how we have to make them moldable. and more appropriate to the Latino culture. Here at the clinic that I'm at, we're a directly operated clinic, and we have formed a Spanish DBT team, dialectical behavioral therapy, and it's one where we've been able to, where it was originally at Harvard UCLA, they're the ones that opened, that modified it for Latinos, and we're doing it here in Long Beach as well. But I kind of, I hear that at the top it needs to be done, or, that these stakeholders should be the ones to initiate it, but it also can be done at the very grassroots levels, like, like we've done it. And, just as, we have other practitioners here who have started, cognitive behavioral therapy in Spanish, and, putting a Latino twist to it, anxiety groups in Spanish, and doing the same thing. So a lot of it can be done at the grassroots level, but, it would be nice to have more resources, like everybody was saying, that comes from higher up.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I think that all of us need to advocate for what the community needs, and I think that hopefully we get to the place we're not having to adapt and translate, but we recognize that within our cultural realm, we generationally have known about healing and have known about treatment and known about intervention. The problem is that the systems have not acknowledged that form. In fact, I think Samuel Martinez will talk about this more next week. But we're now, including more practices, from the Eastern philosophy more than, even though we have a lot of our own, the meditation and yoga and all of that, and all of those are really good practices. But we have a number of those as well. We know herbs, we know sobando, we know a whole lot of, we have a lot of practices that are intrinsic in our culture that families know, that if we were just to recognize and help water those, they could build their own capacity internally as well. But I recognize you, acknowledge you for the work that you all are doing locally, and I think more communities have to do that.
Great, thank you. We have one more question or comment coming from Elizabeth on the line. Elizabeth, are you there? Hello? Okay, we'll come back then. Her line is open if she does. Come on. We had another question coming from Marco, who had stated that I find it hard to convince undocumented Latinos that I am not going to tell immigration for them. What suggestions do you have to convince them that it's okay to open up to me without fear of being deported?
Well, first of all, I think it's a realistic fear. It's not just a fantasy. It's a realistic fear, and it goes on every day. I think that I would suggest the practitioner get out of the role of just being a practitioner. And Ricardo mentioned, and I think Yvette mentioned, the sense of connection and conocimiento, and so that when they just see you as a practitioner, you're part of the system. Mm-hmm. But when they begin to see you as a relationship, that you're really concerned with them, and you really identify with their concerns. Mm-hmm. And when they leave that office, it's a reality. When mm-hmm. they live in their community, that's a reality. And so it's not necessarily, that you will report them, but the reality is that that's a stressor that they face. That's something that they face. And by the way, I've seen it happen in systems where people have said, I'm not going to report you, but then it goes on anyway. So I think it's that personal relationship, it's that connection, it's that conocimiento that becomes the next step.
Great. Another question, and I just want to let you know we're coming up on our time, so this will probably be the last question that we can go ahead and send out and ask, but we will work with the presenters today with getting a few of the other questions that we weren't able to get to answered, and then get you the answers via email. But this last question, is there a place to find resources you've used for measuring change, or where to find articles?
Well, I think all of the presenters here, have resources that if you contact them, they, years of experience. You also can contact us at the National Compadres Network.com, and we can also connect you. Internally, we have, a whole number of resources as well in terms of what we do. We provide a lot of capacity building, a lot of training around these issues, and are connected to these wonderful presenters who were also part of a larger effort that we're embarking on, not only locally and statewide, but nationally.
I think that this question we definitely should throw out before we do depart and leave this webinar today. Is there a group similar for women, similar to the Compadres Network?
Actually, right now they're in the process. There's a Comadres Network that has been gathering, and for years we have. It's interesting that's asked because we didn't feel that we needed to we didn't feel it was our role to take that on. But there are groups, there are women's groups that throughout California and throughout the country, very strong. Yvette may know some of them as well. But one of the things that the Comadres Network is doing, and they're in the beginning stages of developing, is that they're developing a resource list of women's groups, women's support groups, women's guidance groups, women's mentor groups, healing groups, all of that. And so that hopefully should be available within this year sometime. But that is the process is going on. Again, if you want more information, you can contact us, and we can send you to the mujeres that are guiding that process.
Great. Well, Jerry, that seems to be our time. Yeah. We'll leave it to you to close us on out.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody and really just thank Yvette and Ricardo and Cuco for just for who they are, for the tremendous amount of work. What you heard today is a lot of years of experience, but more than that, real strong commitment and passion for people and healing. And I was really, personally, I just want to thank all of you for spending this time. I want to encourage people to reach out to them, and especially, Yvette has that book. I think it's a wonderful book. And Ricardo as well, his publication. Well, I want to thank all of you for attending, and again, look to December 11th. We're going to have several wonderful presenters as well, talking about remedios and curaciones, or beyond treatment and culturally based healing. Thank you all from CIMH for your support in guiding all of this, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Everyone, if you could please make sure to do your evaluation as you exit this webinar, we greatly appreciate it. Everyone have a great day today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.